Welcome everyone to this online lecture. This is a lecture over 18.2, and we're going to be talking about systematics of genetic change. So what we're going to be talking about is systems that could cause genetic change with a population. So just some key questions for today. How does natural selection affect single gene and polygenetic traits? Remember in our past videos, single genes, okay, is just on a single gene. They're kind of contrasting characteristics, dominant or recessive, over that trait. And polygenetic is controlled by many genes all over one trait. And what is genetic drift? What conditions are required to maintain genetic equilibrium? And your vocab for today is directional selection, stabilizing selection, disruptive selection, genetic drift, bottleneck effect, and founder effect. All right, so going on here, we did touch on this a little bit in the last section. Natural selection. Natural selection, what it is it's survival of the fittest. So the adaptations that are beneficial to that environment have a higher chance to reproduce and pass their genes on to the next offspring. So it's just those adaptations, those characteristics that suit the environment best that will have a better chance to reproduce and pass on their genes. One example of this is something that will go on here actually pretty quickly in this area is putting insecticide on your corn plants. This happens quite frequently around here, and what insecticide does is kills all the bad insects that are within that corn species there. And really, looking at the whole ecosystem there, a huge part of it is the insects that are there in the soil, on the plants, whatever it might be. But this insecticide is going to kill those off. Um, is it going to get all of the insects? Probably not. Maybe some insects come in contact with this insecticide and survive. Maybe they have a gene that codes for immunity over this insecticide. Um, all of these other organisms are going to pass away, and these that have this gene will survive. And what do you think will happen during this time? Probably a shift in more insects that could be resistant to insecticide because those are the ones that are passing on their genetics. And pretty soon, what we are seeing now in farming and in all areas of farming is insecticides or weeds or whatever it might be that are resistant to these chemicals that we're putting on them because of the characteristics that are passed on from generation to generation. And we're having to change up our chemicals. So it kind of becomes an arms race between weeds or insects to chemicals. And that's natural selection at work is what's going on there. Okay, so natural selection, we'll talk a little bit more about this on single gene traits. So this is pretty simple here. Natural selection on single gene traits can produce changes in allele frequencies that may be reflected by simple changes in phenotype frequencies. Okay, so we have this initial population here of, it looks like, of lizards. And what is going on here? We kind of have two phenotypes here. We have this green type and a black type. Maybe there was a mutation that went on and a red type occurred. So maybe these are two mutations based off of this initial population, which is heavily this green type of lizard. Okay, and what we're seeing over natural selection, so this is your initial population with some of these mutations over 10 generations, 20 generations, 30 generations of these lizards. We're seeing that, well, this red mutation must not have been beneficial to the environment that they're in. So this is going to die off before 10 generations. But what we do see is this black lizard. Okay, we see this over time here, and 80% to 20%, 70% to 30%, and now we're seeing after 30 generations, 40% to 60%. So something must have favored in this environment black-colored lizards. Maybe it was hiding from this bird here that eats lizards. Um, Maybe it was the ability to heat up quicker and maybe move quicker. Maybe that's what the black coloration did for the lizards. I'm not for sure, but whatever happened selected for this black colored. And you can see probably what will happen is this maintaining of these percentages. We're probably right around that area. All right, so that is natural selection on one gene. It just happens to be, you know, 3 different phenotypes here because of some mutation that occurred. But usually we just have 2 different allele frequencies here, and we can see what happens within that population over time. Okay, sorry, one thing you could see here, you know, maybe this was a mutation. It started out very small, but over time it grew and grew. Maybe this will become a different species over time. You don't know what may happen here, but this could, you know, produce into something that overrides this species here, and this species might die off, and this one might become a new species over a long period of time. Okay, so natural selection on polygenetic traits. Natural selection on polygenetic traits affect a relative fitness of phenotypes in 3 types of selection. We'll get to that in a little bit, those 3 different types. But what I do want to talk about is polygenetic traits. So we talked about this last time. It's controlled, polygenetic traits are controlled on many genes, and it produces a wide variety of phenotypes. So what you can see here on this diagram is a bell-shaped curve. Okay, so this bell-shaped curve here. What this is showing is it looks like skin color. Okay, well, within this population, whatever it's measuring here, a lot of the skin color was at this coloration. Okay, and as we go down the curve, what we're doing is declining the number of phenotypes, number of individuals that have this phenotype, and we can get down here and this 1/64th, so one person out of 64 individuals within this group will have this phenotype. Looks like here 20 out of 64 will have this phenotype, and we can go down the row here, and it's going to be fairly consistent throughout this bell-shaped curve of different phenotypes as we move down and up, but we're going to see the most phenotype of this color. And this is what all polygenetic traits usually look like, is this bell-shaped curve. But this bell-shaped curve could move, and this is what we're going to be looking at. So it could move in this direction, it could move in this direction, it could get taller and taller. More individuals have the selected phenotype. This middle could shrink and the sides could get larger. There's a lot of different things that could happen within this bell-shaped curve, and that's what we're going to be looking at now. So we have directional selection, stabilizing selection, disruptive selection are the 3 types of polygenetic variations that we could have. When a trait is controlled by what we've been saying here, controlled by one or more genes, both the trait and the effects of natural selection on that trait are more complex. So since this is controlled by many genes, okay, we can't get a population that looks like this. After 30 generations, we're going to have a huge change. This will be a change over a very long period of time because of all the variation that's already there. And it's harder to change a population that's variant or different throughout it because of all the different gene pools, all the different alleles within that gene pool. So a normal polygenic trait is graphed as a bell-shaped curve like we talked about. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about here is directional selection. Directional selection is when an individual at one end of the curve has a higher fitness than individuals elsewhere in the curve. All right, so the shift occurs as a result of higher fitness of traits that was once not highly selected for. So you can see here, let's look at this one first. You can see here this bell-shaped curve. This is the original polygenetic curve. And what directional selection is, it's selecting for these individuals at the far side of one of these bell-shaped curves. So this characteristic that's right here, okay, in whatever environment an organism is, it's selected for these phenotypes on this end. So we're going to see a lot more of those over the shift of time in order to see directional selection. So in this case, we're talking about finches on Galapagos Island. And during dry years, there's mostly larger, tougher seeds available as food on these islands. So the birds with the largest beaks favored these times. So during dry years, we had these larger seeds, tougher seeds. So birds with large, tough beaks, which may not have been selected for before, changed over time and became the selected for bird. So that's how these change. This situation over here, we had these light-colored peppered moths at one time. So this was in England. This is a situation in England, and back in the early 1900s, we had an industrial revolution. Okay, what did that produce? Produced a lot of soot in the environment. A lot of carbon was being given off into the environment, and what used to be favored was this peppered moth here. You can see the little spots, and on one end might have been this darker colored, and on the other end might have been this really light colored moth. But the original population favored this peppered of both black and white. As the Industrial Revolution went on and progressed, we could see that the darker colored moths had a better chance of survival. And that's why we could see this directional selection over time shift that bell-shaped curve to selecting for a lot of these darker colored moths. Okay, so that's directional selection. Stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection takes place when individuals near the center of the curve have higher fitness than individuals at either end. So the center of the curve remains at a current position, but the curve begins to narrow over time. So we can see that this is the bell-shaped curve here, and the phenotype in the middle that occurs more often is selected for even a higher selection for this trait, and we see this very steep peak in the middle here, selecting for this characteristic, and nothing really goes outside of that. So they kind of stick to this right in the middle there. Okay, so what this explains is robins. Robins tend to lay 4 eggs each season, and when they lay more, there is too many offspring and there's not enough food. So that's not really selected for. 4 or more really isn't selected for because offspring would die. If there's too few eggs, which would be out here, offspring could not be healthy. So they have to have other individuals surrounding them. So 4 is the magic number for robins, and that's what we usually see in a nest, and that's why it's very selected for here. And that's the trait that we see a lot of in the stabilizing selection. So it narrows over time is what that bell-shaped curve does. Okay, and then last one here of disruptive selection of polygenetic traits. Disruptive selection happens when phenotypes at both the upper and lower ends of the curve have higher fitness than individuals near the middle. So at one time, if natural selection is strong enough for a long enough time, the single curve can split. So we used to have a lot of phenotypes right here that the environment selected for. Okay, for some reason, something happened for a long enough time, and what disruptive selection then selects for are the extreme ends of the bell-shaped curve, and you can see the phenotypes that were once selected for will dip down. This could produce 2 distinct phenotypes, creating an increased diversity within the species. So we could see a lot of whatever trait this is down here, and what